you back again to the Barnabas study, and I've been talking a little bit about some books that have been profitable to me, and I've kind of taken part of that stimulus is from some of the impact that Brother Ernie Jolly had on my life. Certainly as a young man, I can remember him teaching at our senior youth camp in Alabama. This would have been back in the 70s. And Brother Jolly was on the district youth committee. That tells you how long ago that was. And he was very involved in that, and then later on was one of our district leaders, but he would be one of the daytime Bible teachers for some of our classes. And the sad thing about it is at the time I was really too young to appreciate the impact that Brother Jolly had certainly on us as young men. But when I became older and started preaching, just the impact that he had certainly moving me in the direction of ministry, and certainly of the need for study and to read books, that he had an impact on me. And I have to tell you now that I have a host of books around me in my personal library. And thankfully, I was able to, after Brother Jolly passed away, he had gotten rid of a lot of his library. I think he gave it to one of our Bible colleges, but what remained, he shared with a very close elder minister friend of his in Bessemer. And this man, whenever he retired and was moving away, he had so many books that he wanted to get rid of them. And so I ended up purchasing a very large portion of the books that remain behind that Brother Jolly had. So a lot of the books that I have, I say a lot, some of the books that I have, if I look in the front of it, it's got the little seal. Brother Jolly had a seal that you see a notary public uses, and it said from the library of EEJ, Ernie Jolly. And so I do have a lot of those books that I purchased from this other minister that whenever he retired, that he did sell to me. So again, that even puts more of a connection that I have with Brother Jolly. I really like some of the books that I open up, some of the old sermon books that Brother Jolly would write out over the sermon. He would say a masterpiece, or he would say excellent material, or he would write out to the side, preached on, and he would write the date down out in the side where that he would preach that message to his church there in Bessemer, Alabama. One of the men that Brother Jolly encouraged me to read that took a little bit of time for me to get involved with was a man by the name of Martyn Lloyd-Jones. And I can remember as a young preacher, Brother Jolly told me, he said, sell everything you have and you buy everything that Martyn Lloyd-Jones has written. And I'll be honest with you, I purchased some of Lloyd-Jones' books, and at very young, it just did not appeal to me. I would say that there's a certain amount of maturity and knowledge that has to take place in your ministerial development. But as time went on, I really began to gravitate toward a lot of Martyn Lloyd-Jones' writings. I'll talk to you about some of his writings in another video at a later time. But today, in this one, I would like to talk to you about just some of the biographical material that I found about Martyn Lloyd-Jones. The first biography that I read about Martyn Lloyd-Jones is written by a man by the name of Tony Sargent. And the title of the book is called The Sacred Anointing, the Preaching of Dr. Martyn Lloyd-Jones. And I would tell you that this book right here was very, very beneficial to me whenever I purchased this book. In fact, I found it at a bookstore, family Christian bookstore. This is long before they went out of business. I purchased this book probably sometime in 1996, 97, and I can tell you, I remember when I was still working full-time at the hospital. I worked in a cath lab, and this book was a book that I took with me every day and kept it in my backpack. And and would read it. And in fact, I've read it one other time. I read it all the way through, and then I picked it up and reread it again later on, a few years after I had read it. But he talks about the fact about how that there is time. One of the things that he talks about, one of the famous Martyn Lloyd-Jones lines is about how that what is great preaching? He said, great preaching is doctrinal logic that is on fire. And he said that if a preacher has a passion for God, then whenever he preaches doctrine, that those people that are listening to him preach, that they will sense something in that preacher's soul about what he is doing, that he is working for. Now, he talks about the fact about how that you need to work out your what he calls propositions in preaching. One of the things that he talks about is that he raises a question and he answers a question. He'll ask a question during his preaching, and if you download the app from the Martyn Lloyd-Jones Trust, you can listen to some of his messages that he will preach. Now, I will say this: Martyn Lloyd-Jones is somebody that has to grow on you. You're not going to immediately pick up and start listening to him or even read his books if there is not, that they do have to grow on you. We live in a day of extremely superficial biblical knowledge, and so when you start reading his books, if you are reading a lot of the modern day kind of classic, kind of superficial glaze across the surface, and I did hear minister last week make an excellent analogy that I wholeheartedly agree with, that the book publishing industry and the Christian, and it's an industry, the Christian book publishers these days, books are being turned out so quickly that they are very, very superficial in a lot of their treatment. Martyn Lloyd-Jones is not going to do that. He is going to invest time into a depth of doctrine and theology. Now, obviously, I do not hold some of his doctrinal points, and anytime that I read these books, I'm certainly reading with a filter. But whenever he's preaching, he will ask a question, he'll raise a question, and then he'll answer this. And he talks about how are we to cope with the problem of sin. And he says to deal with sin, we need to realize the nature and the consequences of sin, the importance of the soul and its destiny. He says that sin must be hated and everything must be done at all cost in an attempt to destroy it. The ideal in this matter is to have a clean and a pure heart. The goal is sin's mortification. And then he says, okay, if that is the goal, then how are we going to accomplish that goal? He says the flesh must never be fed, and the flesh has to be restrained, and the price that had to be paid to deliver us from that sin has to be appreciated. So those are ways where that he talks about that. That's in that particular book. Brother Jolly also, early on, he told me about this book, and this is a dual volume of Martyn Lloyd-Jones, and these are written by Ian Murray from the Banner of Truth. And I would just say this about the Banner of Truth: if you ever start purchasing books from the Banner of Truth, there's one thing about these books: they have an excellent, just the binding, it's Smythe's on, and it's not just a glued deal. The hardbound copies, they're very, very attractive volumes. In fact, I was hesitant to write in my Banner of Truth books for quite a number of years, and then I started thinking I need to start marking these books up. But after I had read the Sacred Anointing, Brother Jolly had encouraged me to read this dual volume about Martyn Lloyd-Jones. Now, I can tell you that these two books, the first book is almost 400 pages. And then the second book is right around 800, a little over 800 pages. So you've got about 1,200 pages of biography to read about Martyn Lloyd-Jones. But I can tell you this: It took me I didn't sit down and just read them straight through all the way. But whenever I did read these, I had a pen and a journal, and I was taking notes out of that. That's one thing that I feel like that I wish somebody would have told me when I was a young preacher, that any book that you read, to sit down and to have a journal out while you're reading that book and make observations, put page numbers on that. Later on, I would have the occasion to spend some time with our Assistant General Superintendent, Brother Paul Mooney, whenever I served on the executive board, and so was in a very unique relationship with Brother Mooney, and was able to spend a pretty significant amount of time with him while I was in various meetings. And that's one thing that he shared with me about his own book journals, and I can only imagine the value that is going to have for his family later on after he passes on from this life. I'm certainly not expecting that to be anytime soon, but he is an elder among us. That is going to be very valuable for his family. So I just encourage you to do that while you are working and reading through your books. Now, if you don't have the time and the energy to read 1,200 pages about Martyn Lloyd-Jones, and Martyn Lloyd-Jones, one of the other things that kind of attracted me to him was that before he really went full-time into the ministry, he was a physician and was one of the top physicians in Great Britain. He walked away from a very successful medical career and became a minister there in London. But if you don't have time to read all 1,200 pages, then thankfully what they have done is they have taken this volume, and it is a sort of an abridged work of the 2 volumes that I showed you earlier, and it's just simply called The Life of Martyn Lloyd-Jones. It's paperback, and it is published by the Banner of Truth as well.